Today we are at Galveston Island Brewing. Again, still Labor Day weekend, and the nice folks here are going to let me record their 1 p.m. tour of their brewery. It's not very big, it's just right in here. It's got a bunch of barrels in here, so we're going to see what that's all about on this episode, Texas Brew Crafters.
So what we're going to do is just go back here into the brewery itself, and I'll kind of point out the different pieces of equipment and the ingredients that go into beer, and open it up to questions. I know there's a lot of beer enthusiasts in town with the Brew Fest going on just down the road here. So I suspect we're going to have some people that know how beer is made. We're probably also going to have some people that don't. So I'll answer all those questions. We'll move around the corner here. Watch your head. Got CO2 overhead here. So I'll just kind of go through the brewery specifics here before the rest of the folks show up. We started back in 2014. They brewed the first beer here in about March. They kind of tweaked the recipes and upgraded them from a standard 5-gallon homebrew setup to the 5-barrel system that they had operating at that time. Tweaked the recipes, got it up and running, and opened the doors in June of 2014. So we've been open just over 4 years now. We've really grown. The brewery originally was a 5-barrel brew house, which was an old Franken brewery. It was the standard dairy equipment that had been retrofit to make beer. And then it was, hey Charday. And then it was transferred from there into a combination of a couple 5-barrel fermenters. There was a 2.5-barrel fermenter that was a homemade system. And then they quickly got a 10-barrel system or 10-barrel fermenter to take on excess. When we first opened, we had 12 taps on the tap wall, and we opened up with 12 beers on tap. So it was a pretty good assortment of beer, stockpiled, ready to go.
How many now?
Right now, you know, it really varies. There's still 12 taps on the wall in there, and they generally have just about every one of them with something on it. Everything was driven by word of mouth and social media. A lot of Facebook presence originally. I didn't hear about the brewery until 2 days before they actually opened things up. I'm an avid home brewer here on the island. I work my day job is over at Moody Gardens managing the animal programs, but I homebrew and I like good beer. I drive past here all the time. I saw something happening in this little old warehouse on the side of the road. One day I drove by and I saw the shiny equipment in here, and I was amazed that there was a brewery opening walking distance from my house. Dangerously convenient, I like to say. And I came in on the opening day of the tap room and fell in love with Citra Mellow, West Coast IPA, very aromatic Citra hops. Nobody in Texas was doing that style of beer at the time, and I quickly grew accustomed to coming over here after work and sometimes calling in sick and coming over to help out in brewing. The brew process is very similar to what's been going on in Germany for hundreds of years. It's a 4-ingredient recipe. It's malted barley, water, yeast, and hops, and those are the 4 ingredients that are typically found in most beers. There's a lot of adjuncts that are added in to add flavoring here and there. We really don't do a lot with that. We do coriander in our tiki wheat. It adds a little bit of a peppery, lemony kind of a flavor to it. It's a long accepted addition to most craft brewing in Germany. We also do some secondary flavoring with things such as fruity flavors in some of the beers, and also we do some barrel aging with whiskey barrels and rum barrels. darker beers, heavier bodied beers, a little bit higher alcohol content tend to hold up a little bit better in those conditions and lend themselves very nicely to those secondary flavorings. Almost everything is produced in the 20 barrel system behind me right now. This came online about a year ago. It dramatically increased our ability to produce a lot of volume, and it also really kind of helped us with efficiency and creating consistent beer taste. The old brewery system had a lot of manual labor. There was a lot more guesswork involved in the brewing process. This is a lot more automated, actually. There's a touch screen up top there that kind of allows you to do a lot of the brewery operations between the two vessels. There's still a lot of valve turning down here. You have to know where things are going and when they're going there. Keep up with timing, ingredient additions, that kind of thing. But for the most part, this is a lot more what you're going to see in a lot of the breweries that are out there these days. It's a 20 barrel system, so each brew that we do will produce 20 barrels or 40 of the half kegs that you're familiar with. It's a vessel that's about that size. Most of our bigger fermenters are up in the 40 barrel range right now. So in order to do a brew in one of those, it's a double brew day. So we stage the ingredients in the afternoon of the day before. They're ready to go first thing in the morning. We'll do one batch, get it going. It gets transferred over into the fermenter, and then the second batch is going. We get the whole process done in about a 12-hour day. It's very straightforward. It's a two vessel brew process. There's a mash lauter tun on this side. Essentially, if you think about brewing or making oatmeal, that's kind of what you're doing. You're taking a malted grain. It's a malted barley. The malting process imparts many different taste and color and characteristics to the grain, the seeds that come out in the taste of the beer. The kiln process that they use, they can impart a chocolatey malty flavor in it. They can impart a caramel flavor. They can impart reddish coloration into it. The basic kiln process or malting process involves taking a seed, you're tricking it into thinking that it's germinating and it's spring and it's going to sprout into a plant. There's some enzymatic processes that start to occur inside the seed, and then you're stopping that by exposing it to high heat and low humidity, and it sets it into a static state that you can then store it in grain bags, keep it in warehouse settings, ship it all over the world. It's very stable at that point, and then you can use that over the course of a year or a couple of years in the brewing process. The recipe calls for specific amounts of the different types of malt, and so those are all weighed out. They're run through the Grist Mill, which is this little blue hopper system back here. Again, that was the original Grist Mill from the 5-barrel system, but it works quite well for the 20-barrel system behind us here. It just takes longer to pour more bags of grain through that, to crush them, break the husk. It augers them up into the hopper on the other side of the can stacker here, and stores them for the brewing process the next day. Those get mixed in this vessel with 170 degree Fahrenheit water. The end product is about 150 to 160 degrees depending on the recipe. There's an auger in there that kind of stirs it around. If you can imagine, again, just making oatmeal. But ultimately what you're doing is you're pulling the liquid off the oatmeal, which has all the dissolved sugars in it, and you're leaving all the solids. The goal is to have sugar water or wort, which has as much of the sugars removed from that grain process as possible, leaving as many of the proteins and the solids in this vessel. Those are pumped off the bottom of this vessel into the brew kettle over here. The brew kettle is a copper, or it's a steam jacketed vessel. It's a stainless steel vessel with steam around the outside of it that then allows you to control the temperature in there very precisely. You want to have it as quickly to boiling as possible and maintained at boiling for as long as possible. Doing two things in there. You're breaking down those complex sugars or starches into simple sugars that the yeast can then metabolize and use in that process. You're also sterilizing it. So you're killing any yeast or mold or bacteria that's in the Galveston environment and creating a sterile liquid that then you can then add your preferred yeast strain into and allow that to happen, again, in a sterile vessel under temperature control over here. The third thing that happens in that process is you're adding hops, which is the third of the 4 ingredients in this process. And hops counteract the sweetness that you get from the malted barley. Essentially, you're pulling the sugar water out of here. You're counteracting that flavor with some hops. The hops are a flower from a vine, which has a taste profile that varies all over the place. There's probably about 250 different varieties of hops on the market right now. Many places are experimenting with those to create very specific end products. You have hops that impart a very bitter flavor when you add them early in the boil process. You have other hops that you add late in the boil process, or even dry hop in the fermenter, that add much more of the aromatics, less of the bitterness, more of the aroma and the sweetness, pine resin, all the way over to citrus and grapefruit flavor. Mostly it's a palate thing that's up in the upper nose area when you're drinking it. That's a West Coast IPA style that uses a lot of those more aromatic hops and less of the bitterness that comes through. Finally, what you're doing is you're taking that liquid that has 3 out of those 4 ingredients in it. It's basically ready to go. You're running it through sterile hoses over into a sterilized fermenter. You're running it through a heat exchanger to drop it from near boiling, 215, 220 degrees, down to about 68 degrees. Goes into the fermenter. Oxygen is added into that, yeast is added into that, and you just basically allow that whole metabolic process to happen. That's where the magic happens. The yeast are chewing up those sugars, they're breaking them down, producing 2 byproducts. One is alcohol, the other one is carbon dioxide. In that fermentation process, we allow the carbon dioxide to boil off to the environment during that first 6 to 8 days. You'll see a couple of the fermenters have a hose coming off the bottom, going into a bucket, and you'll see bubbles coming out. That's CO2 that's being produced from those yeast in that process. From there, you're essentially going to then take control of that. You're gonna chill it down. Again, those are double jacketed containers as well. They've got chilled glycol around the outside. Depending on a valve system, we can open or close it, allowing more or less of this chilled glycol to go through and control the temperature within that environment. After about 7 days, once most of the sugars have been chewed up and converted over to alcohol and carbon dioxide, then you're going to cold crash it. Essentially, that drops all of the yeast activity down into the conical bottom of these fermenters. The bottom layer of that is all going to be byproducts from the brew process and dead yeast cells, and those get drained off to the waste system. Those get drained off to the sewer. Then we harvest the yeast. There's active, healthy yeast in there that we want to maintain over about 8 to 9 generations. We'll harvest that out. It goes into the big open top vessels like this, the keg systems with the open tops on them. Those get put into the cold storage and then reused in the next batch of beer. It maintains a little bit more consistency in the flavor, creates a little bit more of a ownership of sort of the yeast and the process that occurs here in our brewery. And over time, we hope to get to the point where we can culture our own yeast here in the facility and have our own yeast strain. Most of the big breweries do that. We still rely pretty heavily on commercially available yeast. It creates a very good, consistent flavor for us. Again, we go about 7 to 9 generations. After that, you get into more chance for mutation, more chance for other sort of Galveston yeast being involved in that, and it creates a little bit more variability in the finished product. So from there, it's a finished product. It's kind of green, we call it. Flavor needs to develop a little bit more. It needs to age a little bit more. We can either do that by holding it in the keg, in the fermenters under temperature control, or putting it into kegs and putting in the cold storage under temperature control. or canning it and putting that out, again, under cold conditions for some length of time. It will develop a little bit more complex flavor. Most of our beers are best served between about 28 days after the brew process up through about a month and a half. Our distribution system allows for that right now. We've got a heavy demand for the beer. Here on the island, there's about 70 different areas where we're distributing it ourselves. Hotels, restaurants, bars. We've got a half a dozen facilities up in the Clear Lake area that we're self-distributing to. We've got one of our brewery ops guys that lives up there, so it's very easy for him to take kegs back and forth to his house and service those accounts. And then we're also using a distribution system that takes our kegs and cans and basically distributes everything north of the causeway, up through Houston, out through Beaumont, back down to Pearland. So it's a fairly good distribution. We're probably not going to go beyond that. Our facilities are not going to allow for the production of beer to really push it out too much farther beyond that. We do have plans to expand. We're going to push the warehouse facilities down this direction. We're going to add some additional fermentation out here. We're probably going to develop more of a barrel-aged beer setup at some point, maybe some soured beers. But right now we're happy to be kind of the brewery at the end of the road down here on the island. So
what sort of distribution to Houston do you have?
We go up to the Harris County line. So we basically are into kind of South Houston, but not beyond that at this point. There's
Tiki or?
The beers that we have distributed are Tiki, Citramello, Oktoberfest is out now. We typically have Blue Bridge Amber out. I think there's a fifth one out there that we have on distribution most of the time. There's about 5 that are out there most of the time. But we have, again, up to about a dozen of them in here. We play around more with the hop profiles, with the IPAs, the double IPAs, the Hazy IPA, which just went on tap yesterday. That's the first one that we've done of that style.
Actually, I missed them. I don't live in Houston, I guess you can guess, but I missed the first batch. I was very happy to get this one.
This is technically the first batch. We just put it on tap last night, so it's still the same keg. So good to have it.
Y'all distribute in Houston?
No, we use Del Papa Distributing that takes us up to the Harris County line. So we don't actually go up into Houston. There's some cost increases by crossing the line. There's also, from our standpoint, it's a little bit scary because that opens up a whole new market that we don't think we can support consistently with volume. Yeah. We would much rather have people come down and enjoy our island and drink our beer down here. So.
I'm on board.
Yeah.
Your main limitation is the fermenters, right? I mean, that's the longest.
What's that?
The fermenters are the longest process?
Yeah, the fermentation is the longest process. Again, the brewing takes about 8 hours total. Between bulk grains going in to beer going in and yeast being added to it. Fermentation takes 7 to 10 days depending on the style of beer. Once it goes through that fermentation process, we typically will cold crash it and maintain it in the fermenter for another couple of days. I think our brewer Jason doesn't like to really have beers pushed out of the fermenters any sooner than about 18 days. That's what he really likes. And beyond that, we like to hold it a little bit before it gets served, because again, that beer it's complete, it's ready to go, but we call it green. It's got just a little bit of the hops are a little bit harsh. The hops and the malt haven't really kind of melted yet. Yeah. Once that liquid starts coming out and it's more of a consistent paste that's more of a creamy white color, that's the live yeast cells. And from there, then we'll just dump it directly into one of these. And typically what we'll do is we'll weigh it as it's going in. You don't want to corral too much of it in a vessel like that and risk kind of killing it. Essentially, you're just kind of keeping it on cold storage. So you're keeping the yeast in a contained vessel, in a form of stasis where it doesn't have any sugars to act on. It really doesn't have anything to do other than just kind of sit there. And then we'll do the same thing when we redose it back in. We'll do a live cell count on it. We'll make sure that they're healthy, viable cells in there. Microbiologist that works on staff knows what she's doing in figuring out how viable it is. Even if it's not completely viable, if it's 70% viable, we just make an adjustment on how much we put in. Then we can weigh that out and we can have an approximate number of cells. Again, it's up in the probably hundreds of millions of cells that are going into a 40-barrel fermenter to dose it correctly. And most of what happens actually happens in the fermenter. You know, these cells are just the parent cells, and then they have, you know, their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids are the ones that are actually doing most of the fermentation in that process. I say 7, 8 generations. It's actually way more than that, because essentially we're taking what comes out the bottom of that process and putting it back in here, and then it goes back in. We'll do 7 or 8 times successfully that goes in. So it's probably closer to, you know, 30 generations or something. But there is a level of risk once you get beyond a certain point that you're going to get enough mutation in there that the efficiency of the yeast is going to go down, or the end product of the flavor is going to go someplace you don't want it to go. Or you're going to get, you know, a risk of enough bacterial contamination or environmental contamination into that yeast that it's going to change that balance. Yeah.
It's actually a microbiologist assessing.
Yes, yeah. So every day we have people that are pulling samples off all the fermenters. They're looking at the specific gravity, which is, it tells you how much of the sugars have been converted over to alcohol. It also tells you ultimately at the end what the alcohol content is going to be on that. We also will pull yeast samples off that to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So, yeah.
Even at the final alcohol content of the yeast distill, it's not where the yeast kills all the alcohol, or the alcohol kills all of the yeast. You're basically still leaving, there's a mix of live and dead that you then...
Yeah. Yeah, most of the yeast we use here is the Chico strain ale yeast, which is pretty standard for most home brewing. There's a couple of different places that make it and commercially supply it, but it's the same yeast strain, and it imparts a very clean, crisp flavor. We're able to do some beers that are typically done in a lagering style using the ale yeast that have that really clean flavor to them. The Causeway Kolsch, the Blue Bridge Amber, they have a very clean, crisp flavor profile that that you could, you know, go the extra step of going to a lagering process. Different yeast, it's a longer fermentation, it's colder conditions, it takes up more fermenter space over a longer time. You know, that's not a beer style that we sell a lot of, so we're not going to eat up our brewery space doing that. So
biggest volume is tiki, or Citra?
Biggest volume is tiki. Citra's a close second. We really pushed the tiki initially. We called it the gateway beer. It was the beer that if you're a Bud Miller Coors drinker, here, try this, and they go, oh, that's really good. It's also a really good chick beer. Girls like it. So it kind of hits a lot of flavor profiles. A lot of people liked it. It was really high profile. It's easy to drink. And it got the most attention for the first 2.5, 3 years. For me, Citramello was the one that really kind of got most of the push, because it was that, you know, that aromatic, grapefruity West Coast IPA. Back in 2014, there was really nobody in Texas that was doing that. Now there's a number of brewers that have come online and are doing that, and which I love. I love that style. This Hazy Ipa, the New England IPA, that's a new style. It has a boatload of hops in it, but you don't really appreciate the hops. They add a lot of cloudiness to the beer. I don't think that you really get the payback on the flavor on it. So there's a lot of cost in hops that goes into beer production. I think it's wasted on a style like this. Yes, yeah. There's a lot of hops that goes into a Hazy IPA, New England IPA. Again, We don't have the space or the time to really play around with a lot of the aged beers, the double IPAs, the really heavy barley wines. We will do those. People like them. We typically will then do small batches. We'll break down a fermenter. We'll do a small batch, barrel age them, and then do special releases at different events, different parties.